You know, it's a peculiar thing about politics. It isn't just a matter of who shouts the loudest or who insists they are the strongest. Power is fragile, far more fragile than it looks from the outside. And when a nation like the United States, once the unquestioned economic and cultural superpower, finds itself negotiating with a country like India, the dynamic changes in ways that are not immediately obvious. See, Trump can't simply march forward with the same bluster he might direct at smaller economies or weaker players, because India isn't weak anymore. It's not the India of the 1970s or even the 1990s. It's a rising, complicated, deeply ambitious civilization that's rapidly learning how to use its population, its technology, and its global influence to command respect. And that means, for Trump or for any American leader, really, the old playbook of toughness, tariffs, and intimidation doesn't work. Not here. What we're seeing is the shifting balance of power in real time. And if you look carefully, you'll notice something else. Trump's political survival, his capacity to look strong at home, paradoxically depends on not being too strong against India abroad. Because if he pushes too hard, the consequences, economic, strategic, cultural, are not just costly, they're catastrophic. And that reveals something fundamental. The world where America dictates terms unilaterally is over. When we talk about economics and power, we're not simply talking about numbers on a spreadsheet or GDP figures recited in the news. We're talking about something much deeper, an entire web of relationships, dependencies, and psychological realities that determine how nations behave toward one another. For much of the 20th century, America could lean on countries like India because India didn't have the leverage to resist. It was a developing economy, heavily dependent on aid, and America could play the role of benefactor or disciplinarian depending on what suited its interests. That's what power looked like back then, the ability to impose tariffs, sanctions, or restrictions, knowing the other side had no real choice but to comply. But the problem is that world doesn't exist anymore. India has become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And it's not just growth in the abstract. It's growth that has produced an enormous middle class, a booming technology sector, and a global influence that spreads into Silicon Valley, the pharmaceutical industry, and even space exploration. India's rise isn't fragile. It's not dependent on the whims of Western powers the way it once was. It's rooted in demographics, innovation, and a sense of national self, confidence that's growing year by year. So here's the issue for Trump or for any U.S. leader, really. You can't threaten a nation that has options. You can't pressure a country into submission when that country can turn around and find willing partners elsewhere. And India has options. China is right there. The European Union is eager to deepen ties. Russia has a long-standing relationship, and organizations like BRICS are providing alternative platforms for trade and cooperation. If America tries to apply the old tactics of economic intimidation, it risks being the one left out of the conversation. That's the reversal. That's the irony. The act of trying to dominate now actually weakens America's position. And this is where the psychology comes in. Trump's political persona has always been about toughness, about projecting dominance. But when faced with India, the reality is that the economics no longer allow for that posture. To be too tough is to lose access to one of the largest markets in the world. It's to alienate a country that can supply not just cheap labor, but high-skill innovation, defense cooperation, and cultural influence. It's to risk making India an adversary at a time when the U.S. desperately needs friends in Asia. So the logic forces Trump into a paradox. He must appear strong while actually being careful, even restrained, in his dealings with India. That's the significance of India's economic rise. It's not simply that the numbers are bigger, it's that the old model of U.S. dominance no longer functions. India has entered the global stage with enough weight to tilt the balance, and Trump, for all his bravado, can't afford to ignore that. In fact, he's constrained by it. One of the things people fail to appreciate about geopolitics is that it's not just a game of economics or ideology, it's a contest of survival, of order against chaos. And nowhere is that more evident today. than in the shadow cast by China. China is not simply another competitor on the world stage. It is a civilization with a vision of dominance, with a centralized state apparatus willing to use surveillance, control, and sheer economic scale to challenge the existing balance of power. And if you're the United States, this isn't just inconvenient, it's existential, because the old assumption that America would always remain the unrivaled hegemon has been shattered. China is the rival now. So where does India fit into this picture? Well, India is uniquely positioned. It shares a border with China, it has fought wars with China, and it has deep anxieties about China's expansionist tendencies. And unlike many other nations that fold under Beijing's economic pressure, India has resisted. It has banned Chinese apps, reduced dependence on Chinese technology, and invested heavily in its own defense sector. This makes India not just another player in the global system, but a frontline state in the contest with China. If the United States is serious about containing China, then aligning with India is not optional, it's necessary. Here's the paradox for Trump. His instinct is to act unilaterally, to project that America can go it alone, that toughness and tariffs are sufficient. But in the face of China's rise, America doesn't have the luxury of unilateralism anymore. It needs allies, real allies, not symbolic ones, in India with its population of 4 billion, its growing economy, and its geopolitical location, is perhaps the most important ally of all. To be tough on India, to push it away, is to undermine the very coalition that the U.S. needs to balance China's influence in Asia and beyond. Consider the psychology of the situation. China projects itself as inevitable, unstoppable. That message demoralizes its competitors, but when the U.S. stands with India, it sends the opposite signal, that there is an alternative vision of development, one rooted in democracy, cultural pluralism, and a measure of individual freedom. That alliance, even as a symbolic gesture, destabilizes China's narrative of inevitability. It shows the world that there are two great powers, India and the U.S., standing together against authoritarian centralization, and that's the heart of the matter. Trump can't afford to be tough on India because every ounce of pressure he applies risks pushing India closer to neutrality or worse, into arrangements with China and Russia. That would be catastrophic for America's long-term position. The only viable strategy is partnership, mutual recognition of power, shared military exercises, technological cooperation, and diplomatic coordination. So, in the final analysis, India is not simply a friend in the conventional sense. It is the strategic counterweight to China's ambition, and if America mishandles that relationship, if Trump mishandles it, the balance of global power shifts decisively, perhaps irreversibly, in China's favor. That is a risk no American leader can afford to take. When you look at the structure of global power, you might think it's built entirely on military strength or political maneuvering. But if you examine carefully, you'll see that much of it comes down to market, access to consumers, to people who buy, who innovate, who drive demand. A country can't project power for long if its economy stagnates, and an economy can't grow without a thriving market. That's why India, at this moment in history, is so crucial. It's not just another developing economy, it's one of the largest consumer markets on Earth, with more than 1 billion people, hundreds of millions of them moving steadily into the middle class, hungry for goods, technology, entertainment, and opportunity. Now, Trump built his political identity on the idea of putting America first. He spoke endlessly about protecting American jobs and confronting unfair trade practices. But here's the paradox. American companies cannot flourish if they are locked out of emerging markets. They can't sustain innovation or profitability if they confine themselves solely to domestic consumption. They need places where growth is exponential, and right now, nowhere offers that scale quite like India. For technology, giants like Apple, Google, and Amazon, for pharmaceutical companies, for energy firms, India isn't just a bonus, it's essential for their future survival. And so, if Trump were to be tough on India in the old sense, imposing tariffs, restricting trade, or treating India as a subordinate rather than a partner, he wouldn't just be punishing India, he'd be punishing American companies, American workers, and ultimately the American consumer. Because the global economy is interwoven, denying yourself access to India's market is like denying yourself oxygen in a race. You might look strong for a few steps, but very quickly you collapse. There's also a deeper psychological dimension here. The American dream has always been tied to the idea of opportunity, expansion, and growth, but in a saturated domestic market, that dream risks stagnation unless new frontiers are embraced. India represents one of those frontiers. And people sense it, even if they can't articulate it. The young American entrepreneur, the multinational CEO, the engineer, all of them are aware, consciously or unconsciously, that India is not just a distant nation, but a future customer, collaborator, and innovator. That puts Trump in a peculiar position. His rhetoric demands toughness, but the logic of the global economy demands accommodation, even partnership. If he alienates India, he undermines U.S. business interests. If he embraces India, he risks appearing softer than his political persona allows, but reality doesn't care about rhetoric. The truth is that no president, Trump included, can afford to ignore or antagonize a billion-person marketplace that is becoming increasingly central to the world economy. So the conclusion is stark. India's consumer market is not a side note. It's a central pillar of global commerce in the 21st century, and Trump, for all his talk of dominance, is bound by that reality. To cut ties, to be overly aggressive, is to choke off America's own economic lifeline. When we consider international relations, it's tempting to reduce them to raw power, military might, economic clout, diplomatic maneuvering. But beneath those visible structures, there are deeper, almost invisible forces that shape how nations perceive one another. And one of the most powerful of those forces is legitimacy, the sense that a country stands for something that others can respect, even if they don't fully agree with it. Without legitimacy, power collapses into tyranny, and alliances dissolve into mere transactions. With legitimacy, even limited resources can become amplified because people trust, cooperate, and rally behind a shared vision. Now, here's where India becomes truly significant. Unlike China, which has centralized power in a one-party authoritarian system, India has chosen the far more difficult path of democracy. It is messy, it is chaotic, and it is imperfect, but it is real. Over 1 billion people, divided by language, religion, class, and region, still participate in one of the largest democratic experiments in human history. That gives India not just strength, but moral weight. It means that when India speaks, it does so with the credibility of a nation that, for all its flaws, shares a foundational alignment with the democratic ideals espoused by the United States and much of the West. And that alignment matters, especially now, because the battle shaping our century is not just about who dominates trade or technology, it's about whose political model wins. China offers the world a vision of centralized authority, control, surveillance, and conformity. India, by its very existence, offers an alternative that democracy, pluralism, and freedom can survive, even thrive, at massive scale. For the United States, aligning with India isn't just pragmatic, it's symbolic. It reinforces the idea that democracy isn't a Western export, but a global aspiration that can adapt across cultures and civilizations. For Trump, this presents a strategic reality he cannot ignore. If he were to take a hardline stance against India, he wouldn't simply be risking economic fallout. He'd be undermining America's own claim to moral leadership. Because the American story, at its core, has always been about freedom, self-determination, and the defense of democracy. To punish or belittle the world's largest democracy would be to contradict that very narrative, and in doing so, weaken America's global influence. There's also a cultural dimension here that's impossible to dismiss. Indian culture, its diaspora, its arts, its philosophy, its contributions in science and technology, has become deeply interwoven with the fabric of American society. Millions of Indian Americans are part of the U.S. workforce, education system, and political landscape. That shared cultural exchange strengthens ties at a grassroots level, making the relationship between the two nations more than just transactional. It is psychological, civilizational, and moral. And so, when you put all this together, the truth becomes unavoidable. India's democratic and cultural legitimacy elevates it into a partner the U.S. cannot afford to antagonize. For Trump, being tough on India isn't just a strategic misstep, it's a contradiction of the very principles he claims to defend. The alignment between the two nations is too deep, too symbolic, and too necessary to dismiss. One of the things we often underestimate in politics and in life is the power of alternatives. If someone has no choice, you can pressure them, you can dominate them, you can corner them. But once they develop options, once they can walk away, the entire balance of power shifts. That is precisely the reality the United States faces with India today. For decades, India relied heavily on Western powers for economic support, technology, and access to global markets. That dependence allowed America to wield leverage, to dictate terms, to play the role of senior partner. But those days are gone, because India now has genuine alternatives, and that changes everything. Consider Russia. The relationship between India and Russia is long-standing, rooted in decades of defense cooperation and political alignment during the Cold War. Even today, a significant portion of India's military hardware is Russian-made. And Russia continues to see India as a crucial partner in balancing Western influence. Then consider BRICS, an alliance that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanding to include others. BRICS represents an alternative economic and political platform outside the Western-dominated order, and India, by its mere presence in that bloc, signals to the world that it does not have to be exclusively tied to the U.S.-led system. Now think about what happens if Trump decides to be tough on India. Perhaps he raises tariffs, or uses harsh rhetoric, or seeks to corner India diplomatically. Does India simply fold under that pressure? No, instead, it leans further into these alternative relationships. It buys more oil from Russia at discounted rates. It deepens its trade with China despite tensions. It amplifies its role in BRICS as a leader of the so-called Global South. In other words, by being aggressive, Trump doesn't bring India closer. He drives it further away, and every step India takes toward these alternatives weakens America's own influence. This is where the psychology becomes unavoidable. Nations, like individuals, crave recognition. They want respect. They want to be seen as equal players at the table. When that respect is denied, resentment builds, and eventually they seek validation elsewhere. For India, being treated dismissively by the U.S. is intolerable, especially at this stage of its rise, and the symbolic act of turning toward Russia or BRICS is more than strategy. It's a statement: we don't need you as much as you think we do. That is the danger Trump faces if he tries to strong-arm India. The irony is profound. The tougher America is on India, the more freedom India has to realign itself in ways that actually threaten U.S. interests, and this is not theoretical. It's already happening. India's purchase of Russian oil despite Western sanctions, its leadership role in the BRICS summit, its push for trade in local currencies, all of this illustrates a world that no longer revolves exclusively around Washington. So the conclusion is clear. Harsh policies don't force India into compliance. They force India into alternatives, and every alternative India embraces diminishes America's leverage in the long run. Trump, whether he admits it or not, has no choice but to tread carefully, because the cost of arrogance is not just diplomatic friction. It's the loss of strategic influence on the world stage. When you look at politics, especially in a democracy, it's not only about foreign policy or international relations, it's about perception at home. Leaders don't survive merely by crafting clever strategies abroad. They survive by convincing their citizens that those strategies are working, that they're strong, competent, and trustworthy. And this is where the relationship with India becomes particularly delicate for Trump. Because what he does with India doesn't just echo in New Delhi or Washington. It reverberates through American households, American communities, and American voting blocs. Consider the Indian American community. It is one of the fastest growing, wealthiest, and most highly educated immigrant groups in the United States. These are people who contribute massively to sectors like technology, medicine, academia, and business. They are also politically active, increasingly influential, and they watch closely how India is treated on the global stage. If Trump were to adopt a harsh, dismissive stance toward India, he wouldn't simply be sparking tension overseas. He would risk alienating a domestic constituency that is becoming more significant with each election cycle. And politics, after all, is about coalitions. Alienate enough groups, and the coalition cracks, but there's more. American voters, regardless of background, crave stability. They want to believe their leader can keep the world from descending into chaos. Global disorder creates fear, fear of economic downturns, fear of conflict, fear of the unknown. Now, if Trump were to take an unnecessarily tough line on India, the result could easily be instability, trade wars, diplomatic rifts, even military tension in Asia. That instability would not look like strength to voters back home. It would look like recklessness, and Trump, for all his reputation as a disruptor, still needs to project control. He needs to appear as the man who bends chaos into order, not the man who unleashes it. There's also a symbolic layer here. For decades, American presidents have spoken about democracy, freedom, and partnership. To turn suddenly against the world's largest democracy would be a glaring contradiction. The American people, at a gut level, still resonate with the story of freedom. They may not analyze geopolitics in detail, but they sense when actions betray foundational principles. And for Trump, who already faces skepticism about his consistency, alienating India would provide ammunition to critics who argue that his leadership is impulsive rather than principled. So you can see the trap. Domestically, Trump must cultivate the optics of strength without hostility, firmness without recklessness. He needs the support of Indian Americans, the confidence of the wider electorate, and the reassurance that America's global partnerships are holding steady. That means India cannot be treated as a punching bag in the way he might treat a smaller nation. The costs politically and psychologically are simply too high. And so, at the end of the day, Trump's hands are tied not just by international realities, but by domestic ones. He cannot afford to alienate India because to do so would fracture support at home, destabilize global perceptions, and undercut the very image of strength he works so hard to project. That is the paradox. He must appear tough, but he cannot actually be too tough.